we're now joined by Professor Brendan Mackey, Director at Griffiths University's Climate Action Beacon. Thank you so much for joining us, Prof. Let's kickstart by asking you, what are some key takeaways from the talks?
Well, certainly one of the big decisions, and this is new, is that what's called loss and damage is now activated as part of the implementation plan. And loss and damage refers to the adverse and destructive impacts of climate change that cannot be avoided, either by avoiding and reducing any further greenhouse gas emissions or by adaptation, adjusting to current and future impacts. This is just, we've changed the climate so much that things of value are going to be lost and damaged. So there's been a lot of resistance on the part of developed countries to accept this notion of loss and damage and to establish a funding mechanism for it. I think one of the important things to note is that loss and damage here is not, it's different from what are called climate reparations, i.e. it's not talking about liability or compensation for past harm from climate change we've experienced to date. It's about payments to developing countries for the current unavoidable climate impacts. So that was certainly a very big and welcomed decision at this COP.
Well, you mentioned about the resistance on loss and damage by developed countries. Well, it wasn't agreed till the very last moment. Well, the fund is really hailed as a game changer for poorer nations. Do you really think it will actualize?
Well, that's the question that we now have to wait for the answer. Related to this question of funds for loss and damage is climate finance more generally. So one way of thinking about the loss and damage decision, it's one part of a portfolio of decisions and issues around climate finance. For example, the transition to a low carbon economy globally is estimated to require investments of at least $4 to $6 trillion per year. And that's in addition to the adaptation fund that was agreed to in the Paris Agreement on climate change, where developed countries would raise $100 billion every year for helping developing countries make clean development and adapt to climate change impacts. So if you look at all the climate finance, those three components, we've got the transition to low carbon economy, we're talking trillions a year. For adaptation for developing countries, we're talking about $100 billion. And now we're talking about money for loss and damage for the unavoidable loss and damage from climate change.
Well,
very little of those funds have been mobilised at all to date.
Well, apart from this agreement alone, COP27 didn't really set tougher emission targets. We just heard from a couple of leaders expressing their disappointment. What do you think is considered a missed opportunity at COP27?
Yeah, certainly one of them, that was the big missed opportunity. At Glasgow, there was an attempt to get agreement to rapidly phase out all fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, all three forms. Instead, we got some very muted language, which has basically been, to put it bluntly, copied and pasted from the Glasgow summit. Some might say it's merely mouthed text. So, the text reads, accelerating efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Now, that's very weak language because actually there's no such thing as abated coal power. It's all unabated. And there's many economists would argue there's no such thing as efficient fossil fuel subsidies. So what does that text actually say? What's needed now, and the IPCC science is very clear on this, is rapidly transiting our economies away from using fossil fuels to clean energy sources. So that was a missed opportunity here for some really strong text about climate action regarding the transition away from fossil fuels, all fossil fuels, to clean energy sources.
Well, Prof, climate experts and activists say that the world is still, it really stands at the brink of climate catastrophe after the deal reached at the COP27 summit. How important is their call for the biggest economies to make fresh commitments to really cut greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, it's very important now that the big emitters step up. About 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the EU 27 countries, plus an additional 15 countries, such as Japan, Australia, but also Indonesia, Mexico, India, etc. Collectively, the EU 27 plus 15 countries account for about 80%. China accounts for about a third now of annual emissions, the USA about 12%. So China, the USA and the EU 27 together are over 50%. So a few countries can now make a huge difference. Interestingly, the COP27 decisions include an interesting paragraph 15, which recognises that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees requires rapid, deep and sustained reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions of 43% by 2030 relative to 2019. So we actually need, the document does really specify that we need a really, really sudden, significant drop in emissions, 43% by 2030 in only 8 years' time compared to what it was 2 years ago. So the science is clear, the document acknowledges that, and it's really now time for the big emitters to step up. The thing to understand about these COPs, that the decisions are made by consensus. What that means is that every country has to agree to every decision. And this is why the negotiations are so difficult and why they often appear to teeter at the edge of collapse towards the end, because it only takes one country to hold out to block the document. So what we have now is a document with a clear statement as to what's needed going forward.
Thank you very much for your updates. That was Professor Brendan Mackey, Director, Griffith Climate Action Beacon at Griffiths University.